When the flood waters receded, Enlil looked out at the world. He expected silence. He had planned for silence. The assembly of gods had voted. The oath had been sworn. Every divine being had agreed, no warning would be given. No human would survive. And then he saw the boat, floating on the receding water. Intact. Sealed with bitumen. Exactly as a certain god had specified. The Atrahasis tablet, British Museum Catalogue number BM 78941, records what happened next in words that have survived nearly 4,000 years. Enlil was furious. He did not rage at the flood. He did not rage at Atrahasis. He looked across the assembly of gods. And he looked at Enki. What followed was not a punishment in the simple sense of something taken away as discipline. It was a permanent restructuring of the relationship between Enki and humanity. A sentence. Handed down by the divine assembly. Pressed into clay. And still in force in the world you woke up in this morning. Welcome to the Shadow Ancestral. Every episode on this channel is built from documented evidence. Museum collections. Academic translations. Sources you can verify yourself. Tonight we go into the aftermath of the most consequential act in the entire Sumerian record. Enki saved humanity. And the divine assembly made him pay for it in a way that has never been fully reversed. Subscribe right now if you are new here. Before we go further, understand something. Every claim we make is sourced. Every tablet we reference is real. Every story we tell is verified. There is no other channel doing this at this level. Subscribe. And find out why. Now, back to the assembly. And the god who was about to face it alone. To understand the punishment, you need to understand that the flood was not the first time Enki had defied Enlil. It was the fourth. The Atrahasis epic, documented across 3 clay tablets in the British Museum, records each intervention in precise sequence. Intervention 1. Enlil sent plague. A divine command to Namtar, the plague god, to reduce the human population that was disturbing divine sleep. The literature and history analysis of the Atrahasis describes what happened. Enki was no longer allowed to communicate directly with Atrahasis. But he found a way. He instructed Atrahasis to concentrate all worship on Namtar alone, to make the plague god feel so honored and embarrassed by the undeserved attention that he withdrew the plague. The plague ended. Enlil was furious. Intervention 2. Enlil sealed the heavens. No rain. No crops. The Euphrates turned to dust. The literature and history analysis describes Atrahasis standing at the river and weeping. For the first year people survived on old stores of grain. The tall grew slumped. The muscular became withered, their faces crusted and gray. And then Enki acted again. He taught Atrahasis secret rituals to concentrate all worship on Adad, the storm god, with the same result. Adad was so embarrassed by the concentrated attention that he allowed rain. The drought ended. Enlil was furious again. Intervention 3. Enlil sent famine. Sealed the heavens and dried the rivers simultaneously. This time Enki was restricted from communicating directly with Atrahasis at all. But the Wikipedia documentation of the Atrahasis records what happened. Enki released fish into the rivers. He sustained the starving people through the environment itself. Through what was already there. Without speaking a word to a single human being. Enlil confronted Enki directly. The literature and history analysis records the confrontation. Wrathful Enlil railed against Enki to any god who would listen. The stern Enlil could not understand why the wise god of the sweet fresh waters kept impeding his plans to destroy humanity. At an assembly, Enlil demanded that Enki take a binding oath. No more interventions. No more warnings. No more fish released into rivers. Enki took the oath. And then, he broke it. Enlil convened the final assembly. Every god was present. Every god swore. The flood would come. No god would warn humanity. Not one word. Not one sign. Enki, who had already broken 3 previous agreements, was bound by this oath in the presence of every Anunnaki. The Wikipedia article on Atrahasis documents the oath precisely. Enlil made Enki swear before all Anunnaki that he will never speak another word to any human. Never. Not another word. To any human. And then Enki, the god of wisdom, found a loophole. The Levius.org translation of the Atrahasis tablet records exactly what he did. Wall, listen to me. Read Wall, pay attention to all my words. Flee the house. Build a boat. Forsake possessions and save life. He did not speak to Atrahasis. He spoke to the wall. To a reed wall. Not to a human being. The oath, technically, was unbroken. The New World Encyclopedia analysis of Atrahasis describes what happened when Atrahasis discovered what the dream and the wall meant. The clever Enki devised a way to warn Atrahasis without technically breaking his oath. Technically. That word is doing everything. Because Enlil, when he looked at the boat floating on the receding flood water, was not thinking about technicalities. He was thinking about intent. And the intent was clear. The flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights. When it ended, Atrahasis opened the door of the ark. He stepped onto the mountain. He built an altar. He offered sacrifices. And the gods, who had not received a single offering during the entire duration of the flood, descended on the smoke like flies. The Wikipedia documentation of this moment records it precisely. Enki and Belaili, the mother goddess, grieved for their creation. The gods began to suffer from hunger since they no longer received food offerings. They had not considered this. When every human died, every offering stopped. The gods who had voted for the flood had voted themselves into starvation. And then Enlil arrived. He looked at the gathering gods descending on Atrahasis's sacrifice. He looked at the boat. And the Wikipedia article records his reaction in the most direct terms in the entire text. Enlil is outraged to discover that humans have survived. He confronted Enki. The Encyclopedia.com analysis of the confrontation describes the moment. Enlil was furious at Enki for ruining his plan. Enki's defense, documented in the New World Encyclopedia, was this. He denied breaking his oath. He argued, I made sure life was preserved. Not, I warned Atrahasis. Not, I told him to build a boat. I made sure life was preserved. The wall heard his words. The wall acted. He had not spoken to any human. Enlil did not accept the argument. And the assembly, the same assembly that had voted for the flood, now voted on what to do with the god who had undermined it. We are at the halfway point. And what comes next is the specific punishment the assembly handed down. Not one consequence. 5 documented changes to the cosmic order that came directly from Enki's decision to speak to a wall instead of staying silent. Subscribe to the Shadow Ancestral right now. Every episode on this channel is built from verified sources. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Now, the verdict. The first and most significant punishment was not new. It was the permanent enforcement of the oath that Enki had just technically violated. The Wikipedia article on Atrahasis documents it in the clearest possible terms. Enlil made Enki swear before all Anunnaki that he will never speak another word to any human. Not until the next assembly. Not until the population is controlled. Not as long as Enlil lived. Never. This was the permanent structure that replaced the temporary oath Enki had found a way around. Before the flood, Enki had communicated with Atrahasis directly. Face to face. Through servants. Through dreams. After the flood, all of that was gone. The God who had created humanity from his own divine formula, who had taught the Apkallu what to teach, who had whispered through a reed wall to save every human being alive, was permanently silenced. No more direct communication. No more warnings. No more fish released into rivers. The God of wisdom, in relation to humanity, had been made mute. The second punishment was not directed at Enki. It was directed at humanity. And it was the punishment that changed everything about what it meant to be human. Before the flood, the Sumerian king list records kings reigning for tens of thousands of years. The pre-flood civilization operated on a different timescale. A different relationship with time itself. After the flood, the reigns collapsed dramatically. Not because of a different method of counting time. Because of a decision made in the divine assembly immediately after the flood. The New World Encyclopedia analysis of Atrahasis documents this decision with extraordinary precision. Enki and Enlil agreed that other means must be devised for controlling the human population. From now on, all people must eventually die. From now on. Not, people had always died and this was just how things were. From now on. A new rule. Implemented after the flood. As a direct consequence of the Divine Assembly's deliberation about how to prevent the situation that had just occurred from occurring again. Human mortality, according to the Atrahasis tablet, was not a natural condition. It was a punishment. Or more precisely, a policy decision. Made by the same assembly that had just voted to destroy every human being alive. And survived. The God who had saved them from complete destruction, could not prevent this. His permanent silence meant he could not argue against it. Could not find a loophole. Could not speak to a wall and have the wall deliver immortality to the people he had made. The third punishment was the one the assembly spent the most time specifying. Because mortality alone, they calculated, was not enough. Humans lived too long even if they eventually died. The population would still grow too large. The noise would return. The New World Encyclopedia documents the specific instruction that followed. Enki instructs Nintu, the mother goddess, to arrange it that a third of human pregnancies will not succeed. As a demon will, in the exact words of the text. Snatch the baby from its mother's lap. A demon. Named. Assigned. Specifically tasked with ensuring that a third of all human children would not survive. This was not a natural process. Not a reflection of ancient medical reality. Not something the Sumerians were observing in the world around them and attributing to divine will. This was the text describing an active divine decision, made in the aftermath of the flood, to build loss into the structure of human reproduction permanently. The mother goddess Nintu, who had wept when the flood came, who had been documented grieving her creation, was instructed to implement the mechanism of that loss. And she complied. Because the assembly had voted. And Enki, permanently silenced, could not argue against it. The fourth measure was more institutional. The New World Encyclopedia documents it alongside the infant mortality decision. They also institute various classes of priestesses who will be taboo, and thus keep down the population. Taboo. In the specific Mesopotamian sense, set apart. Separated from ordinary human life. Forbidden from reproduction. The Natatu priestesses of Babylon, documented in cuneiform temple records spanning centuries, were women dedicated to specific temples who were forbidden to bear children. The Entu priestesses, the highest ranking, were forbidden from marriage entirely. The Kadishtu, documented across Neo-Babylonian records, served in temple contexts with specific reproductive restrictions. These were not voluntary religious choices in the modern sense. According to the Atrahasis text, they were a structural mechanism. Designed and implemented by the Divine Assembly in the aftermath of the flood, to ensure that the human population would never again grow to the level that had disturbed divine sleep. Institutions that lasted for over 1,000 years in Babylonian society. Traced back, in the oldest recorded text that documents their origin, to a punishment meeting. Held after the flood. When Enlil was still furious. And Enki was already silent. The fifth consequence was the most personal. It affected the one man who had done nothing wrong. Atrahasis. The exceedingly wise man. The one who had built the boat. The one who had loaded the animals. The one who had sealed the door with bitumen and survived the darkness for 7 days and 7 nights. The Wikipedia documentation of the Atrahasis records what the gods gave him in exchange for his survival. The gods endowed Atrahasis with their immortality and gratitude, and settled him with his wife on the island of Dilmun on the distant edge of the world. Immortality. At first reading, a reward. But read it again. Settled him. On the island of Dilmun. On the distant edge of the world. Not in Babylon. Not in Shuruppak, the city where he had lived. Not among the humans he had survived to represent. On the edge of the world. The man who knew what Enki had said through the wall. The man who had heard the instructions directly, through the reed wall, who knew exactly what the God of wisdom had risked to save him. Was removed from human society. Given immortality, and placed somewhere no living human could reach him. Where he could not tell anyone what he knew. Where no human could ask him what Enki had actually said. Where the memory of what had happened, the direct communication between Enki and a human being, could not be passed on to the population that survived. Reward and removal. In the Sumerian record, they were the same thing. Before the punishments were handed down, Enki argued. The New World Encyclopedia documents his defense in specific terms. Enki denies breaking his oath and argues, "I made sure life was preserved." 3 arguments embedded in that single statement. First, technical compliance. He had not spoken to any human. He had spoken to a wall. The oath was satisfied in its letter if not its spirit. Second, the consequences of total destruction. The gods had already discovered what humanity's absence meant. No offerings. No prayers. Gods descending on smoke like flies because they had not eaten for 7 days and 7 nights. Enki's act of preservation was also an act of divine self-interest. Third, and this is the argument the Forgotten Histories analysis identifies as the most significant. Enki disagreed with Enlil's approach. While he respected divine law, he saw the value of human life. This was not a loophole argument. This was a moral argument. Enki was telling the assembly that what Enlil had done was wrong. The Levius.org translation of the Atrahasis preserves Enki's own words about Enlil's plan. Enlil committed an evil deed against the people. Evil. Not a harsh decision. Not a difficult choice. Evil. Enki used that word in the text about his brother's plan. And the assembly, which had voted for that plan, handed down 5 punishments in response. His argument was recorded. And then, overruled. Here is what the punishment actually cost. Not Enki. Enki returned to the Abzu. To the place the inside of which no other god knows. Where the Me were kept. Where the 7 sages waited. Where the tablet of destinies remained in his possession. He was silenced, but he was not diminished. He was restricted, but he was not destroyed. What the punishment cost, was the relationship. Before the flood, there was a direct line between the God who had created humanity and the human beings he had made. Enki spoke to Atrahasis directly. Through servants. Through dreams. When restricted, through a wall. There was always a way. There was always a voice that found the gap between the rules and the outcome. After the flood, after the 5 punishments were handed down, that line was permanently severed. The God of wisdom, who had created us, who had given us the Me, who had sent the Apkallu to teach us, who had whispered through a wall to save every one of us, was permanently silent. And what replaced direct communication? Was the record. The tablets. The temples. The Apkallu figurines buried under floors. The bit Mesri rituals performed by exorcists. The scribes copying astronomical tables. All of them, participants in what the spoken past article called the act of stewardship. Keeping what had been given. Because the one who gave it could no longer add to it. Could no longer correct it when it was misunderstood. Could no longer find a loophole when the assembly made another decision that he believed was wrong. The clay tablets, the ones in the British Museum right now, the ones that describe this entire story, are the only voice Enki has left. Not his voice. His record. What was documented before the silence was imposed. And whoever reads them carefully. Here's what he was saying before the assembly took his words away. Enki saved humanity. He spoke to a wall and gave a man the instructions to survive the end of the world. The divine assembly found him guilty of intent if not of letter. And they handed down 5 permanent changes to the structure of human existence. Enki permanently silenced. Human mortality established. Infant mortality built into reproduction. Celibate priestesses institutionalized. The one witness, Atrahasis, removed to the edge of the world where no living human could find him. Every one of those consequences is documented in the Atrahasis tablet. British Museum. BM 78941. Translated by scholars. Cited in peer-reviewed papers. Available to anyone who knows where to look. The God who made us, who defied the assembly to save us, who called what Enlil did an evil deed, has been silent since the flood receded. Not gone. Not destroyed. Silent. In the place the inside of which no other God knows. If this video opened something in you, subscribe to the Shadow Ancestral right now. Leave a comment. Do you think Enki's punishment was just, or was the assembly wrong to impose it? Share this with someone who thinks the gods of ancient Mesopotamia were simple mythological figures. Next week, we go to the tablet that describes what Enki said to the 7 sages before he sent them through the door the first time. What he instructed them to teach. What he told them to withhold. And the one piece of knowledge, documented in the Cuneiform, that was given to no human being. Ever. The shadow has more to show you. He called it an evil deed. And they silenced him for saying so.